Please welcome Dr. Antonia Gatward Cevizli on stage. Dr. Antonia completed her PhD at the University of Warwick, specializing in cultural and diplomatic exchange between Italy and the Ottomans in the 15th century. The title of the paper she presents today is Bellini, Bronze and Bombards, Sultan Mehmed II's request reconsidered. Please welcome her.
There we are. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon. So, Gentile Bellini's portrait of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II has become a very familiar sight. For example, if you glance through the library shelves of books on Ottoman history or Venice's relations with the East, you'll see quite how emblematic the image has become. Bellini's portrait even makes an appearance in books with as broad-ranging interests as the entire world history. In Armesto's The World, a History, Bellini's portrait is singled out for mention in that publication. And it now travels the world, featuring in various exhibitions. It's currently in Brussels. But does the portrait really merit this level of fame? And are the aims of Mehmed's requests fully understood? So I'd like briefly just to go over the events that brought about this commission, although I'm sure that that's something that's already familiar for many of you. So following the conclusion of peace between Venice and the Ottomans in January 1479, in September 1479, Gentile Bellini travelled to the Ottoman court of Sultan Mehmed II and most probably stayed in Istanbul until January 1481. And it was during this period of time at the Ottoman court that he produced the famous portrait. And now to turn to an account of Bellini's first visit, which was first written in the mid-1480s by Jacopo Filippo Foresti da Bergamo, and I'm going to just read an extract from that. His talent one day reached the ears of Mehmed, Prince of the Turks, who, burning with desire of seeing him, wrote humbly to the Venetian Senate with a request that it should, as a great favour, send him to him in Istanbul as a gift. When he arrived, in order that his art might be tested even further, Mehmed required that he himself be rendered in his own form. And when the emperor beheld the image so similar to himself, he admired the man's powers and said that he surpassed all other painters who ever existed. And so began the myth of Bellini and the East with those words. And Giorgio Vasari then picked up on the threads of Foresti's text, adding further embellishment, claiming that Mehmed was unable to believe that a mortal man like Gentile Bellini could express the things of nature so accurately that it seemed he had an almost divine ability. And Vasari really heightens the extent of Mehmed's admiration, even going so far as to claim that Mehmed was so impressed that he was prepared to go against the Islamic prohibition of images. But contrary to what Foresti claimed back in Bellini's day, Bellini was not requested by name. There was certainly nothing humble about Mehmed's demands. And what I hope to demonstrate in this paper is that there was much more to Mehmed's requests for Italian artists than simple admiration. Recent years have seen another dimension added to the story, in which Bellini is cast as a sort of cultural ambassador, and the period in question is seen as a moment when former enemies came together in dialogue. But I think this interpretation really tells us much more about the concerns of our present times than it does of any historical reality. So there is a need to reassess some elements of Bellini's visit to Istanbul and to ensure that the Ottoman perspective of Mehmed's requests is given just as much attention. And that will reveal a rather different story to the tendency to romanticize this event, which you see in certain contexts. So does Bellini's portrait really deserve all the attention that it gets? Well, another bias that existed for many years is the attention given to the painted portrait of Mehmed at the expense of the portrait medal, the one on this one also designed by Bellini. And in recent years, this comparatively neglected aspect of Mehmed's patronage has been restored, in particular through publications by Julian Raby, among others. But the medal does not quite make it onto the front covers in the way that the portrait does. But I would argue we should be paying more attention to Mehmed's interest in bronze, since the documentary evidence suggests that it far exceeded his interest in painting. In fact, the documents in the Venetian archives are completely silent on the actual request itself for a painter. It's only through the accounts of Sanudo and Malipiero that we know that Mehmed had asked for a good painter who knows how to make portraits. The archives do, however, hold a strong request made at the same time for a sculptor and bronze founder. And the Senate voted unanimously to meet this request and agreed to find a superior metalworker. And the person that they chose was the Paduan sculptor Bartolomeo Bolano, and I've just got an example of his work on the screen here. Now, nowadays, considered alongside as prominent a painter as Gentile Bellini, Bolano has been eclipsed. And rather unfortunately for Bolano, one of the most well-known quotes about him is the damning judgment in 1504 by Pomponio Gaurico, which described him as ineptus artifex. But this view of Bolano's ineptitude was not one that was shared by his contemporaries. And in fact, it reflects a shift of taste which happened after Bolano's death in favour of a more classicising style. And in fact, on the contrary, it was because of Bolano's very great renown that he was selected to serve the Sultan. And in the documents of the time, the Venetian Senate describe him as very famous. Even in later years, despite that shift in terms of taste for something more classicising, Vasari wrote that he was a worthy heir to Donatello and described his very great fame and renown and how he was well esteemed for his valuable skills in metal founding. So instead of considering Bolano as of lesser importance to Gentile Bellini and consigning him to the shadows of this story, we should be giving equal importance to the appointment of Bolano to meet Mehmed's assertive request for a sculptor and bronze founder. Now, one of the reasons that Bolano tends to be pushed to the side is that there are no surviving works made by him in the Ottoman capital. Yet there seems little reason to doubt that Bolano did arrive, because the Venetian Senate wrote in 1480 of the very famous bronze founder that they had sent to Mehmed, and we certainly know that two of his assistants departed with Bellini. Now, I'm not going to discuss the individual medals in detail, because that could be subject of a presentation in themselves, but I do want to focus now on Mehmed's interest in the medium of bronze and his requests for bronze founders. So what motivated Mehmed's interest in the bronze portrait medal? Well, Vasari and Foresti claimed that his interest stemmed from admiration for talented artists whose work he had seen or heard about. There was, of course, much more to it than that, and he did not request these artists by name. It was widely known throughout the Italian peninsula in Mehmed's day that he associated himself with Alexander the Great, and there are accounts reporting on his daily history lessons from Italian tutors, which included studying the life of Alexander. And in 1453, Mehmed's aspirations to emulate one of the heroes of his history lessons were realised, because just as Alexander the Great had begun his Persian campaign aged around 20, and soon after his accession had crossed the Danube, the river that signified the limit of Macedonian territory, similarly, Mehmed was 21 years old when, not long after his accession, he conquered the much coveted Constantinople. And parallels such as these must have reinforced in Mehmed's mind the similarities between himself and the ancient empire builder. And the Alexander Mehmed analogy was promoted from the heart of the Ottoman court. We know that Mehmed commissioned a manuscript copy of Arrian's account of Alexander's life, the Anabasis, which was to be accompanied by a companion piece of the history of Mehmed's own life, inviting comparisons between the Ottoman Sultan and the Macedonian king. There are also manuscripts examples, this one, the story of Alexander or Iskender from Mehmed's reign, in which Alexander or Iskender is given a distinctly Ottoman spin with his characteristic Ottoman turban and a few janissaries in the foreground here. And Ottoman history was also woven into the main body of the text, emphasising further the connection between the two rulers. And so this little digression into Mehmed's interest in Alexander helps us to understand his desire to be portrayed in both painted form and in bronze form. And this was recognised even in his own time when Sigismondo Pandolfo Malatesta, the ruler of Rimini, wrote of Mehmed's similarity to Alexander and recalled how Alexander had been painted by Apelles and had bronze statues made by Lysippus. So that dual approach to portraiture, both painted and bronze, I think is significant. And there is another way in which Alexander is an important model. In the Anabasis, Arrian had described how Alexander had adopted elements of Persian dress and certain customs when presenting himself to a Persian audience, in order, and I quote, that he did not seem completely foreign to them. So just as Alexander the Great had recognised the power of adapting one's mode of expression to different audiences, Mehmed had himself portrayed in different idioms according to the intended audience. So the Sultan's Italian portraits, of which the Bellini painted portrait is one, communicate in a visual language that would be familiar and readily understood by Western viewers. In addition to this, portrait medals had clear imperial associations. Actually, before we move on to that, just to briefly demonstrate that it follows the format of portraiture of the Doges, which Bellini was painted to the Doge. And the way that the three crowns are arranged on either side of the portrait here is in a way giving Mehmed a heraldry or a coat of arms, which of course he would not have, but something which would be understood by Western viewers. The imperial connotations of bronze medals were important not just to Mehmed, but this example of Pisanello's medal of one of Mehmed's predecessors would also no doubt have been known to Mehmed. And when he conquered Constantinople, he added the title Caesar, Emperor of the Romans, Kaiser I Rum, to his collection of titles and set about transforming the city into his own imperial capital. So medals with their imperial connotations no doubt served his purpose. So it's not difficult to understand why Mehmed would have been interested in these Western forms of portraiture. But does this explain the number of requests that he made for bronze founders? And in particular, my next question is, why did the Sultan's attempts to acquire bronze founders become so urgent in the years 1479 to 80? So how many requests did Mehmed make in this period? Well, probably in around 1477 or 78, Mehmed made a request to the King of Naples, which resulted in Costanzo da Ferrara being sent to Istanbul, where he made this medal. Now, there's no surviving documentation of this request in the archives, and in fact, there's very little documentation of Costanzo da Ferrara at all. But it is probable that the request followed a similar pattern to the Venetian request in asking for a painter and a bronze founder. We certainly know that this bronze medal was the outcome of such a request. Then in August 1479, an Ottoman envoy made a request for a sculptor and bronze founder from Venice, which is the occasion when Gentile Bellini was sent out, and Bolano, the very famous bronze founder. And Bellini's medal may well have been cast by Bolano at the Ottoman court. We don't know who cast that, but that's a possibility. In March 1480, an Ottoman envoy arrived in Venice and asked for another bronze founder, the same or even better than the first. So that's further evidence that a bronze founder, who I argue is Bolano, did indeed arrive, even though nothing survives from that visit. And the fact that he asked for one even better than the first, now that has been interpreted by some as a sign that Bolano was in some sense second-rate, that description of him as an inept artifex was just, and that Mehmed II did not think that his work was good enough. But I don't think that is the case, because as I said earlier, in his own time, in the period that we're dealing with, Bolano was a very celebrated artist. And I think perhaps the issue was that Bolano embodied the wrong kind of knowledge. It should be emphasised that when Mehmed is asking for bronze founders, he didn't state what they were supposed to do in the Ottoman capital. So the same or even better than the first, perhaps the first did not quite meet his aims. Another account of March 1480 claims that Mehmed had in fact asked for 3 bronze workers from Venice. In the same month, March 1480, a request was made to Florence for artisans, including masters in sculpting bronze. And from the account of Benedetto Dei, we hear that these demands were met. So these requests to Florence and Venice in 1480 were simultaneous. And the momentum of Mehmed's requests for bronze workers in this period has been described in the literature as bewildering. It's been cited as evidence of Mehmed's great enthusiasm for the portrait medal. And I don't have any doubt that Mehmed did appreciate the value of portrait medals in communicating certain aspects about himself to a Western audience. But the urgency and geographical scope of his request for bronze workers does seem excessive for the purpose of producing medals. And so that is the aspect that I want to examine a little closer. So, looking at the documents in the Venetian archives, the Venetian Senate responded to Mehmed's request for a second set of bronze founders by saying that should they have another founder in their dominion, they would send him immediately. By the following month, the senatorial records claim, "Fondator non si trova como sai." A founder cannot be found, as you know. Now this, as you know, and this is in the deliberations of the Senate, so it's not a letter to Mehmed, but this, as you know, suggests that there has been some previous discussion, which was presumably oral, because there are no records of it. And this statement has been accepted at face value, that the reason that Mehmed's second set of requests for bronze founders was not met was because there wasn't one available. Now, the idea that Venice would have to comb its territory to find a bronze founder is not convincing at all. For many years, Venice's bronze industry had been one of the most active in Europe. There were numerous foundries throughout the city, and at the time of Mehmed's second request in 1480, there would have been plenty of founders in Venice and in the Veneto. So the Senate's statement that they could not find a founder in the whole of the Venetian dominion is simply not true, even taking into account the possibility that a bronze founder may not wish to go to the Ottoman court. Considering all the founders that were present in Venice and the Veneto, seems very unlikely that nobody would have wished to go. And archival documents even allow us to name workshops or individuals from Venice itself and beyond who would have been good candidates to send to the Sultan in the year 1480. So the "as you know" part of this statement suggests that in the previous unrecorded discussion, a decision had been made not to meet Mehmed's requests for bronze founders. So an element of this is perhaps that a lot still hung in the balance with regard to the terms of the peace treaty. Perhaps Venice didn't want to immediately grant Mehmed his every whim. But I think the main issue here is that many of the bronze founders that appear in the archival documents were canon founders, and that is one of the main issues in this moment of exchange. That the ability of a founder to cast not only works of art but also artillery is probably what concerned Venice the most. By 1480, Venice's arsenal and related workshops had one of the largest and most advanced gun-founding industries. And Mehmed had already made use of foreign artillery specialists throughout his reign, mostly from Hungary, Transylvania, and Germany. And his cannons corresponded closely with contemporary European technology, indicating the work of these cannon founders. And there's also Italian evidence that shows that the lending of bronze founders was the principal way in which new technology or updated technology could be acquired from states that were considered to be on the cutting edge of military technology at the time. Venice's own arsenal included a number of foreign gun founders. And one document that I think is particularly significant in demonstrating that Venice was well aware that the services of a Venetian bronze founder, even for a short time, could bring useful new techniques to the Ottoman foundry, is that Venice had been asked to send a founder to the court of Ferrara for just 8 days in order to look at the work of the foundry and the weapons being produced there. So just a short period of time could be enough to communicate significant ideas. And ensuring that his cannon technology was up to date was, of course, particularly important to Mehmed, given that cannon had achieved many of his greatest victories, including the conquest of Constantinople and Negroponte. And in this fresco here, you can see the prominent emphasis on cannons in the representation of that event. It has been noted that the periods in which Mehmed engaged in cultural projects coincide with the times when he was resting from campaigns. But I think it's important to note that the times when he is apparently resting is also when he was planning new campaigns. And in this period, the island of Rhodes was high on Mehmed's agenda, and a contemporary history of Mehmed the Conqueror, written by Tursun Bey, a secretary at his court, claims that Mehmed was planning operations against the Mamluks. And in the spring of 1480, Mehmed sent his cannon founder, Jurg of Nuremberg, to Alexandria on a sort of reconnaissance mission. He was also planning his campaign against southern Italy, which was carried out in Otranto in Puglia in the summer of 1480. So when we consider these years, 1479 to 80, from the Ottoman perspective, there's further reason to believe that the requests for bronze founders had military motives, and that would be particularly for campaigns into Europe. It wouldn't have been so important for a campaign against the Mamluks. And given the importance of cannon in all these campaigns, it's not surprising that in this period, Mehmed would have wanted to have gained as many bronze founders as possible. And if we look at an example of one of Mehmed's cannons with this very sophisticated relief ornamentation, it suggests that he didn't really need a founder to cast medals. That could really have been done by any of the bronze founders that he already had at his court. And instead, these repeated requests for bronze founders, and again I emphasize that he did not state what those bronze founders were to do when they arrived in the capital, but the number of requests, the fact that they are made to Venice and Florence simultaneously, I don't think can solely be explained as an interest in the portrait medals. It would seem rather excessive. So, in conclusion, there was much more to Mehmed's interest in Italian painters and founders than admiration for the novelty of the art that they produced. Bellini and the other overshadowed Italian artists in Mehmed's service were being used for the Sultan's own political ends and were participants in the cultivation of one aspect of the Sultan's image. And as we've seen, portrait medals themselves would certainly have served Mehmed's aims to represent himself as an imperial ruler, but it doesn't fully explain the extent of his requests for bronze founders, nor does it explain why why Venice would have been so reluctant to send him any more. So Bellini did not have a preeminent status at the Ottoman court. The fame of Bellini's portrait seems to be rather because of the accident of survival, that we have surviving works, both the portrait and the medal by Bellini, and we have documentation about his visit. Bolano, Costanzo da Ferrara, these other Italian artists have been overshadowed by him. And it certainly isn't the case that Bellini was preeminent as the current attention that is given to that portrait might suggest. But the portrait does nevertheless draw our attention to many of the broader issues at the heart of the Ottoman Empire's diplomatic relations with the Italian city-states. It gives insights into the way in which Mehmed used Western art forms to promote certain aspects about himself and his rule. And it highlights the importance of a quest for technological know-how, and that's something that I've encountered in other case studies that I've been working on of the Italian city-states' relations with the Ottomans. And then the byproduct of these encounters, cultural exchange, which we've been discussing here. And so it's in this sense, because of the broader issues that it highlights, that I think Bellini's portrait does in many ways deserve its emblematic status, but not because it was perceived by Mehmed as one of the most important artists that he had commissioned. He gave equal attention to his requests for bronze founders, and so Bolano, the portrait medals, and the possibility of exchange in the area of cannon technology should certainly be brought to the fore, which is not quite as romantic as the idea of former enemies coming together in dialogue, but it seems to me that the case was rather different. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Antonia, for this interesting topic. And now we're going to the session of question and answer, please.
Thank you, Antonia, for such a tantalising and engaging presentation. I'm just wondering, first of all, would Venice have seen some sort of military advantage in forging such a relationship with Istanbul, because 1480 was such an important moment in Florence at the end of a war with Rome, for example? And then, on a completely unrelated point, can you remind me of the date of the flagpoles in St Mark's Square by Leopardi? And because I'm just wondering whether they're supposed to look like cannons, and whether there was some kind of, perhaps, possibly, it's 1480s, I think, and whether there's some sort of, they're made of bronze, and whether there's some sort of militaristic agenda going on there as well.
With the last point, I don't know. It's certainly something that's very interesting to look into. The first part of your question, Venice has recently invested in fortifications in their overseas empire, which could very likely be sort of blasted to pieces by Mehmed's cannon. So they certainly wouldn't have been wanting to send any bronze founders that could have helped to develop that, I don't think, given that they just invested all that money in refortifying. But the second point about the flagpoles is something I haven't thought about.
Well, if that's the case, a very quick follow-up question. If you were a sensible state under those circumstances, you wouldn't want to send anybody connected with bronze to
well, I think perhaps Bolano would have been safe, because I haven't been able to find any evidence that Bolano was involved in any sort of militaristic role. And so that's why I wonder if when they said, oh, another bronze founder, the same or even better than the first, it's perhaps because he didn't have quite the right body of knowledge is what I would suspect. because not all of the bronze founders would have been involved in that aspect, and I certainly don't think they would have sent anyone who was casting cannons. Yes.
Well, my question is the technology required from a medal founder the same as that for cannon? Is it the same kind of metal? Can somebody who's used to produce metal also produce cannons?
Yes, I think so, because bronze founders tended to cast sometimes bells, sometimes cannons, sometimes works of art, sort of very interchangeable in the same foundry. And I think a medal is a sort of relatively simple item to cast. So I think it would have been...
Hasn't cannon usually rather iron rather than bronze?
Sorry?
The cannons would be rather made of iron.
No, they were made of bronze in this period.
So it's the same technology. Somebody like Bellini would be able to make a cannon?
Bellini himself was not a bronze founder, so he would have designed that medal and somebody else would have cast it for him. He himself would have had no knowledge of founding.
Thank you.
I grabbed the opportunity. Thank you for your paper. Could I ask you about the other technical advisors that they had from Transylvania, Hungary, and this Jörg of Nuremberg you mentioned?
Yes.
Does that mean there was a team of European bronze founders capable of making artillery already?
Yes, there were.
The court?
There were, and many of them from dating back to prior to the fall of Constantinople.
Sure.
And I think that given that Venice was a renowned centre with the arsenal, that the opportunity to gain more Venetian, more bronze founders from overseas would always have been a sort of additional benefit. But he certainly did already have European cannon founders, and that's why analysis of his cannon show that they already had adopted the screw pipe cannon, and the composition of the bronze is very, very similar to that produced elsewhere in Europe.
I almost wonder if they hadn't recommended he consult
Possibly,
Venetian
yes.
technology
I
to see
don't
if
have
it
any
was...
sort of documentary evidence of that, but it could be.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
It's just interesting exactly at that time, in 1470s or 1470s, 80s, there was a Venetian named Domenico who was producing cannons in Cairo.
Yes, I've read that in one of your articles. Very interesting. Yes, and I think that that this aspect of artists or artisans who have different skills is something that is very important to look into, that somebody who nominally appears to be an artist but may, for example, have a background in inspecting fortifications or in working in other sort of military fields. There are a number of examples of this, and so I think that an artist needs to, his background needs to be investigated in terms of what exactly he has experience of. The same too, sort of slightly shifting away from artists to diplomats. Digressing slightly, but diplomats that I've been working on who went from Mantua to the Ottoman court, those diplomats were unusual in that they weren't just members of the chancellery. They did in fact have a background in the production of armour. So I think studying individuals and what they knew, what their skills were, what their background was, shows that this sort of transfer of militaristic information, I think, was present perhaps far more than we think in exchange between the Ottomans and the Italian city-states.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you
Antonia.
very much.